The signature was worth $874,000, and Malcolm Brooks refused to write it. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Rain hammered against the warehouse roof in long metallic waves. Water dripped from a damaged loading dock light, ticking onto concrete one drop at a time. Across the conference table, 3 executives stared at him. No one spoke, no one needed to, because everyone in the room understood exactly what had just happened. A contract this large did not survive delays. It definitely did not survive a refusal, especially not from a logistics coordinator whose name wasn't even on the company website. Malcolm sat motionless. His hands rested on a weathered leather notebook that had belonged to his father. The notebook was older than some of the employees working in the building. The corners were worn smooth. The spine had been repaired twice with black tape. He carried it everywhere. Nobody knew why. Darnell Hayes finally leaned back in his chair. The movement was small, calculated, dangerous. "You checked the moisture readings yourself?" Malcolm nodded. 3 times. "And you're certain?" "I'm certain." Outside, a forklift rolled past the warehouse doors. Its backup alarm echoed through the building. Nobody inside the room moved. Darnell folded his hands. The gesture looked calm. It wasn't. The shipment waiting in the yard represented nearly 200 tons of corn destined for a food processing facility outside Wichita. The trucks were loaded. The drivers were waiting. The buyers were expecting delivery. Everyone had already been paid. Everyone except the truth. Malcolm had found it 37 minutes earlier. A portion of the grain had been exposed during a severe thunderstorm. Water had entered several storage trailers. The moisture readings were above acceptable standards. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough to create risk, enough to require testing, enough to stop the shipment. Darnell slid a document across the table. "Sign the release." Malcolm didn't touch it. The paper stopped inches from his notebook. The room felt colder. One executive cleared his throat. Another checked his watch. Nobody wanted to be there anymore. Because now this wasn't about grain. It wasn't about logistics. It was about responsibility. Darnell smiled. The kind of smile people use when they're trying to make something sound reasonable. "Malcolm, let's be adults." No answer. "The buyers need the shipment." Still nothing. "The moisture difference is minimal." Malcolm finally looked up. "The regulations don't say minimal." Darnell's smile disappeared. For a moment, only the rain spoke. Then he leaned forward. "You know what happens if these trucks don't leave today?" Malcolm knew. Everyone knew. Drivers would lose hours. Contracts would be delayed. Customers would be furious. Upper management would start asking questions. A lot of expensive questions. Darnell lowered his voice. "No one gets hurt if nobody says anything." The sentence landed softly. That made it worse. Because it wasn't shouted. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like common sense. The most dangerous lies usually do. Malcolm opened the notebook, not dramatically, not for effect, just enough to reveal a faded handwritten sentence inside the cover. His father's handwriting. Thick black ink, years old. "If your name is worth less than money, you are already bankrupt." He closed the notebook, then pushed the release form back across the table. "No." The room froze. One executive actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he couldn't believe what he had heard. Darnell stared at him. "You understand what you're doing?" "Yes." "You understand who you're embarrassing?" "Yes." "You understand what's going to happen?" Malcolm looked through the rain-covered window toward the waiting trucks. Rows of headlights glowed through the storm. Dozens of people waiting for someone else to make a decision. Then he looked back at Darnell. "I do." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Darnell slowly gathered the paperwork. The smile was gone now, completely gone. The meeting ended less than a minute later. No shouting. No slammed doors, no dramatic speeches. Just silence. Sometimes silence is how careers die. By 6 o'clock that evening, Malcolm's security badge no longer opened company doors. By 7, his company email had been disabled. By 8, he was sitting alone in his apartment, eating microwaved soup that had gone cold before he finished half of it. The rain had followed him home. Water slid down the apartment window in crooked lines. The television played quietly in the background. He wasn't watching. His termination notice sat on the kitchen table. 3 pages. Corporate language. Professional wording. No mention of grain. No mention of ethics. No mention of the shipment. Just failure to cooperate with operational directives. Malcolm read the phrase 3 times, then folded the paper, then unfolded it again. A knock interrupted the silence. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at 9:30 at night. When he opened the door, Andre Carter stood there, 24 years old, warehouse driver, nervous. So nervous he kept looking over his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," Malcolm said. "I know." Andre held up a flash drive. His hand was shaking. "What is that?" Andre swallowed. The hallway suddenly seemed very quiet. Then he said something that made Malcolm's stomach tighten. I think they already knew the grain was compromised before the storm even started. Neither man spoke. The rain continued outside. Andre looked down at the flash drive, then back at Malcolm, and what he said next changed everything. I found emails. He paused. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. And if these emails say what I think they say. He looked toward the parking lot, toward the darkness, toward the company both of them had trusted. Then he finished the sentence. This isn't about one shipment. Malcolm did not plug in the flash drive immediately. That was the first thing he did right. People imagine life-changing discoveries happen in dramatic moments. A secret file opens, a shocking truth appears, everything becomes clear. Real life rarely works that way. Real life is usually messier, more dangerous, and often much slower. Andre stood inside the apartment with rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the floor. Neither man sat down, neither felt comfortable enough to. The microwave clock on the kitchen counter blinked 9:42 p.m. The soup had gone completely cold. What emails? Malcolm asked. Andre swallowed. I wasn't looking for them. Then how did you find them? I wasn't supposed to. That answer worried Malcolm more than anything else, Andre explained. 2 weeks earlier, a warehouse supervisor had accidentally forwarded an internal archive folder to the wrong distribution list. Most employees ignored it. Andre almost did too. But one subject line caught his attention. Quality hold procedure. He remembered seeing similar wording during safety training. The file should have been routine. Instead, it contained months of discussions between senior management. The further he read, the worse it became. Not criminal conspiracies. Not movie villain stuff. Something more believable, and therefore more disturbing. Executives discussing ways to reclassify questionable shipments. Managers debating whether certain testing delays could be avoided. Conversations about customer complaints that never appeared in official reports. Each individual message seemed harmless. Together they painted a picture. A company slowly becoming comfortable with cutting corners. Malcolm listened without interrupting. The rain continued tapping against the glass. Andre handed over the flash drive. You should see it yourself. For a long moment Malcolm stared at the small piece of plastic. Then he plugged it into his laptop. The screen illuminated the dark apartment. Hundreds of files appeared, folders, attachments, internal communications, spreadsheets, compliance reports. Nothing looked dramatic, which made Malcolm nervous. The most dangerous evidence often looks boring. For nearly 2 hours they reviewed documents. Midnight came and went. The rain finally stopped. The city outside became quiet. By 1:30 in the morning they had found something neither of them expected. A report, 9 months old, marked internal review only. Malcolm opened it. His eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped, then moved back. He read the paragraph again and again. Andre noticed the change immediately. What is it? Malcolm didn't answer. He simply rotated the screen. Andre read, his face drained of color. The report described moisture issues involving 3 separate grain shipments. All 3 shipments had eventually been approved. All 3 had been shipped. All 3 had generated customer complaints. But that wasn't the problem. Problem was the signature, at the bottom. Approval authorized by Darnell Hayes. The room became very still. That's bad, Andre said quietly. Malcolm looked at the report, then at another, then another. No, his voice became lower. It's worse, because a pattern was emerging. Not one bad judgment call. A pattern. Repeated decisions, repeated risks, repeated approvals. Always favoring profit, always pushing boundaries, always betting nobody would look closely enough. The realization sat heavily between them. Andre finally broke the silence. What do we do? Malcolm leaned back in his chair. His father's notebook rested beside the laptop. For several seconds he stared at it. Then he closed the computer. We do nothing. Andre blinked. What? We do nothing tonight. You just got fired. I know, we have evidence. Maybe. Andre looked frustrated. Malcolm understood why. Young people often believe truth wins immediately. Older people learn something harder. Truth needs timing. At 2 in the morning they agreed on one thing. No copies, no leaks, no social media, no reporters. Not yet. Because once information escapes, control disappears with it. Andre left shortly after. The apartment felt empty again. Malcolm sat alone at the kitchen table. The old notebook remained beside him. Outside, the storm clouds were beginning to clear. For the first time all night he noticed how tired he was. He glanced toward the termination notice, then toward the flash drive, then toward the notebook. 3 objects. 3 futures. One represented what he had lost. One represented what he had discovered. One represented who he was trying not to become. He finally fell asleep on the couch around 3:30 and woke up to a phone call. 8:07 a.m. Unknown number, Malcolm answered. A familiar voice came through immediately. Mr. Brooks? His stomach tightened. Darnell Hayes. There was no greeting, no small talk, no attempt to sound friendly, only silence. The kind that means someone is choosing their words carefully. Finally, Darnell spoke. You had a visitor last night. It wasn't a question. Malcolm sat upright, every trace of sleep vanished. Excuse me? I said you had a visitor. A chill moved through him. Slowly, deliberately. Andre had not told anyone. Malcolm knew that, which left only one possibility: someone had seen him. Or worse, someone had been watching. Darnell continued. Young guy, warehouse driver. Malcolm said nothing. The silence confirmed more than any answer could. Darnell sighed, almost sadly. You're a smart man, Malcolm. The words sounded sincere. That made them more unsettling. You always were. Another pause. Then came the sentence Malcolm would remember for years. The problem with smart people is they think finding something means understanding it. Malcolm gripped the phone tighter. What do you want? The answer came instantly. Meet me. No, then listen carefully. The voice hardened. Not much, just enough. There are people involved in this situation who are a lot more important than you think. Malcolm walked toward the apartment window. His heartbeat had accelerated. Below, morning traffic moved through the street. Normal people, normal lives, completely unaware. Darnell lowered his voice. Whatever Andre Carter showed you. Another pause, another calculated silence. You're looking at the wrong story. The call ended just like that. No explanation, no threat, no warning, nothing. Only one sentence hanging in the air. You're looking at the wrong story. Malcolm stood frozen beside the window. Because for the first time since being fired, a new possibility entered his mind. What if Darnell wasn't the top of the problem? What if someone above him had been pulling the strings all along? And if that was true, then Malcolm Brooks had just stepped into something much bigger than a contaminated shipment. Much bigger than a lost job. And much more dangerous than he realized. The next 3 weeks felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. That bothered Malcolm more than open conflict ever could. People expect retaliation to arrive loudly. Lawyers, threats, public accusations. Instead, nothing happened. No phone calls, no letters, no lawsuits, no investigators showing up at his apartment. Just silence. And silence can be its own kind of warning. Every morning Malcolm woke up before sunrise. Not because he had somewhere to be, because habit refused to die. He still made coffee. Still opened his father's notebook. Still reviewed job listings that seemed to disappear the moment he applied. The termination had spread faster than he expected. Word always traveled quickly in industries built on relationships. A former operations coordinator fired for refusing management directives. That was enough. Nobody asked for details, people filled in the blanks themselves. Meanwhile, Andre remained employed. At least for the moment. That surprised Malcolm. Until it didn't. Because the deeper he thought about it, the more one detail bothered him. If management knew Andre had visited his apartment, why hadn't they fired him? The question stayed in Malcolm's mind for days. Then one Tuesday afternoon it finally got an answer. Andre showed up again. This time he looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders tense, like someone who hadn't slept properly in a week. He sat at Malcolm's kitchen table and stared at a coffee mug without touching it. They promoted me. Malcolm frowned. What? They promoted me. The words sounded wrong, almost absurd. Andre laughed once, without humor. I thought I was getting fired. Instead, the company had offered him a raise, a better route assignment, additional responsibilities. Everything suddenly improved, too suddenly. Malcolm leaned back. The answer arrived instantly. They're watching you. Andre nodded. They want to know if I'm talking. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The realization settled heavily between them. Andre wasn't being rewarded. He was being managed. A useful difference. And a dangerous one. That night they began reviewing the files again. Not searching for evidence of wrongdoing. Searching for structure, for patterns, for names. Who approved what? Who reported to whom? Who benefited? And eventually a name appeared repeatedly. Not in dramatic ways. Not in smoking gun emails. Something subtler. Something more important. Board meeting summary. Executive budget review. Strategic risk assessment. Again and again one signature appeared. Leonard Whitaker, Chief Executive Officer. Malcolm recognized the name immediately. Everyone in Kansas logistics knew Leonard Whitaker. Magazine interviews, industry awards, charity fundraisers, leadership conferences, the face of modern agricultural transportation. The kind of executive newspapers loved. The kind of executive investors trusted. The kind of executive nobody questioned. Andre stared at another document. Then another, then another. Every major decision eventually flowed upward, toward Whitaker, toward the executive suite, toward the top floor nobody below management ever entered. A cold realization formed. Darnell Hayes had authority, but Leonard Whitaker had power. And those weren't the same thing. Malcolm closed the laptop. For the first time since this started, he felt genuinely uneasy. Not because the evidence was weak. Because it was becoming stronger, strong enough to matter, strong enough to threaten people, strong enough to make powerful individuals nervous. The next surprise arrived 48 hours later. At 6:15 in the morning, someone knocked on Malcolm's apartment door. Not Andre, not a lawyer, not a company representative. An older man, late 60s, work boots, weathered denim jacket, gray beard, careful eyes. He introduced himself, Jerome Walker. Malcolm immediately recognized the name, the farmer whose shipment had triggered everything. Jerome entered the apartment carrying a cardboard box. Not paperwork, not evidence, a box. He placed it on the kitchen table. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes, business cards, receipts, phone numbers, names. Malcolm looked confused. Jerome smiled slightly. You're wondering what all this is? A little. It's trust. The answer made no sense. At first, then Jerome's explained. Over the previous year, he had quietly talked to farmers throughout the region. People were frustrated, not angry, worse, disappointed. Unexpected fees, missing inventory, questionable inspections. Customer service that somehow felt more expensive and less honest every year. Nobody had enough proof to accuse anyone, but everyone felt something was wrong. The box represented years of conversations, years of concerns, years of small incidents, none of them large enough to make headlines. Together they painted a different picture. Not corruption, culture, a company slowly forgetting who it was supposed to serve. Jerome sat quietly, then asked a question. Do you know why people trusted you? Malcolm shrugged. I did my job. No. Jerome shook his head. Lots of people do their job. The old farmer picked up one of the receipts. People trusted you because they believed you'd tell them the truth even when it cost you. The apartment became very quiet. Jerome wasn't finished. You lost your job. He pointed toward Malcolm. You think that's the story? Then he pointed toward the box. It isn't. Malcolm frowned. What do you mean? Jerome looked directly at him. The story is that people noticed. The words lingered. People noticed. Not everyone, not immediately, but enough. Enough for a farmer to drive 2 hours before sunrise. Enough to carry a box full of names. Enough to prove something Malcolm hadn't understood. His reputation hadn't disappeared when he got fired. It had started growing. Neither man realized how important that truth would become. 3 days later, the first television report aired. A local news station. Small market, 30-second segment, nothing major. Just an investigation into shipping compliance concerns within regional agricultural logistics. No names, no accusations, no conclusions. But someone had started asking questions, and questions have a way of multiplying, especially when the answers don't come easily. That evening, Malcolm received another phone call. Unknown number. Again, he answered. The voice on the other end wasn't Darnell. It was Leonard Whitaker, the CEO himself. The most powerful man in the company. His tone was calm, polished, professional. The voice of someone who spent years speaking to investors. Mr. Brooks. Malcolm said nothing. Whitaker continued. I think we've both spent enough time looking backward. The sentence sounded harmless, almost friendly. That made Malcolm trust it even less. We should meet. No. A pause. Then a soft chuckle. Not angry, not offended, almost impressed. I suspected you'd say that. The CEO's voice lowered. Then let me offer a different perspective. Malcolm walked toward the window. Traffic moved below. Ordinary life continuing as if nothing was happening. Whitaker spoke carefully, every word deliberate. Have you ever considered that Darnell Hayes may have been protecting you? Malcolm froze. For the first time in weeks, he genuinely didn't know what to say. Whitaker continued, because if you knew what was really happening. Another pause. Longer this time. You would understand why Darnell tried to make you walk away. The call ended. No explanation, no clarification, nothing. Only a new question, a much bigger question. And for the first time since this began, Malcolm wondered if Darnell Hayes had spent the last month trying to hide something from him, or trying to keep him alive long enough to discover it. For 2 days Malcolm could think about nothing else. Why would Darnell Hayes protect him? The question followed him everywhere, through grocery store aisles, through sleepless nights, through long walks beneath the Kansas summer sky. It didn't fit, nothing about it fit. Darnell had fired him, humiliated him, destroyed his career. At least that was what Malcolm had believed. Now uncertainty had entered the story. And uncertainty changes everything. On the third morning, Andre arrived carrying a folder. No flash drive, no dramatic revelation. Just paper, printed documents. Sometimes old-fashioned evidence is the hardest evidence to erase. Andre dropped the folder onto the kitchen table. You need to see this. Malcolm opened it. Most of the pages looked ordinary. budget approvals, insurance records, contract amendments. Then he found something unusual. A series of rejected proposals, submitted by Darnell Hayes. Rejected by Leonard Whitaker. Malcolm read them carefully. One proposed stricter moisture testing. Denied. Another requested independent quality audits. Denied. Another warned about long-term liability risks. Denied. The dates stretched back years, not weeks, years. Andre sat quietly. Neither man spoke until Malcolm reached the final page. A memo 3 years old, short, direct, professional. From Darnell Hayes to Leonard Whitaker. Subject: Operational risk escalation. The final sentence stopped Malcolm cold. If these practices continue, we will eventually damage the trust of the agricultural communities that built this company. Malcolm read it twice. Then a third time. The room felt smaller. Everything he thought he knew was shifting, not completely. Darnell had still made bad decisions. He had still signed approvals. He had still fired Malcolm. But suddenly the picture looked more complicated, more human, and therefore more real. Andre broke the silence. He tried. Malcolm nodded slowly. Not hard enough. No. Andre looked out the window. But maybe harder than we thought. That afternoon another call came. This time Malcolm agreed to meet, not Leonard, Darnell. The meeting took place at a small diner outside Topeka. The kind of place where farmers drank coffee before sunrise. The kind of place where nobody cared who you were. Darnell arrived first. He looked older than Malcolm remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying weight he could never put down. The waitress filled their coffee cups, then disappeared. Neither man touched the coffee. Finally Malcolm spoke. Why did you fire me? Darnell stared into the dark liquid for a long time, then answered. Because if you stayed, they would have destroyed you. Malcolm almost laughed. The statement sounded ridiculous. Until Darnell continued. You think refusing the shipment was the problem? Another pause. It wasn't. The diner suddenly felt very quiet. The problem was that you noticed. Malcolm said nothing. Darnell leaned back, tired, defeated, honest for the first time. When you challenged that shipment, Leonard panicked. Why? Because you had a reputation. The answer surprised Malcolm. Darnell noticed. You think reputation is about power. He shook his head. It isn't. It's about credibility. Darnell pointed toward Malcolm. When people trust you, your questions become dangerous. The truth settled heavily between them. Years earlier, Darnell had made a choice. Not one choice. Hundreds of small choices. Compromises. Rationalizations. Shortcuts. Each one easier than fighting. Each one easier than risking his position. And eventually those choices had become a system he no longer controlled. I told myself I was protecting jobs. Darnell's voice grew quieter. I told myself I was protecting families. He laughed once, a bitter sound. Truth is, I was protecting myself. Neither man spoke. The silence felt earned. Then Darnell reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. Malcolm frowned. What is that? The reason Whitaker is scared. Inside were documents. Original documents, signed originals. Not emails. Board records. Meeting minutes, executive approvals. Proof. The kind lawyers love. The kind investors fear. The kind journalists verify. The kind that changes outcomes. Malcolm stared at them, then looked up. Why give these to me? Darnell smiled sadly. Because some questions deserve honest answers. I should have done this years ago. Outside the diner a freight train passed. Its horn echoed across the fields. Long, low, lonely. For the first time since this began, Malcolm felt something unexpected. Not victory, sadness. Because Darnell wasn't a villain. He was something more common. A decent man who spent too many years choosing comfort over courage. And that realization hurt more. The collapse happened 6 months later. Slowly at first, then all at once. Investor reviews. Regulatory investigations. Board resignations. No dramatic handcuffs, no television spectacle, just consequences, real consequences. The kind that arrive through paperwork, meetings, and accountability. Leonard Whitaker resigned before the final report was released. The company lost major contracts. Stockholders demanded changes. Executives disappeared. Law firms arrived. For months the industry talked about nothing else. And then something unexpected happened. The company went up for sale. Most buyers weren't interested. The reputation damage was too severe. The risk too high, the future too uncertain. Everyone saw a failing company. Except one group, the farmers. Jerome Walker organized his first meeting. 43 farmers attended. Then 90. They met inside a county fair building. Folding chairs, coffee in paper cups, dusty floors. Simple people discussing a complicated future. Malcolm stood before them, unsure why he was there, until Jerome spoke. You spent your career protecting trust. The old farmer looked around the room. Now trust wants to invest back. Over the following months something remarkable happened. Farmers pooled commitments. Local businesses offered support. Regional banks listened. Not because Malcolm was rich, because he wasn't. Not because he was powerful, because he wasn't. Because people trusted him. A year later, Malcolm Brooks became majority owner of the very company that had fired him. The announcement made industry headlines. Most articles focused on the business angle, the turnaround, the economics, the investment. They missed the real story. The real story was sitting in Malcolm's office on opening day. A worn leather notebook, a cardboard box full of names, and an old envelope from Darnell Hayes. 3 objects, 3 chapters of one life. The notebook represented principles. Spox represented trust. The envelope represented accountability. Years passed. The company recovered. Not overnight, not magically. One customer at a time, one contract at a time, one honest decision at a time. The process was slower than shortcuts. It was also stronger. Then came the final surprise. 5 years after the acquisition, Malcolm hired a new ethics and compliance instructor. A man with decades of operational experience. A man who understood mistakes better than most. A man named Darnell Hayes. Not as an executive, not as a manager, as a teacher. Every new employee heard his story. The whole story, no excuses, no editing, no self-pity, just truth. And somehow that honesty became one of the company's greatest strengths. People listened. Because lessons learned through pain tend to sound different. One autumn evening, many years later, Malcolm locked the office after everyone had gone home. The parking lot was empty. The air smelled faintly of harvested corn. Inside his office, the old notebook rested beside the window. The same notebook, the same faded sentence. If your name is worth less than money, you are already bankrupt. He smiled, then looked across the room, at the box of names, at the envelope, at the life those objects represented. The strange thing about integrity is that it rarely rewards you immediately. Sometimes it costs you everything first, a job, a reputation, years of certainty. But eventually, people notice. Not everyone, not right away, but enough. Enough to change a life, enough to change a company, enough to change a community. Before leaving, Malcolm turned off the office light. The room went dark. Only the evening sunlight remained. Soft, quiet, ordinary, exactly the way he liked it. Because in the end, the greatest victory wasn't owning the company. It wasn't proving anyone wrong. It wasn't watching others fall. It was waking up every morning knowing that his name had become worth more than money. And that was something nobody could ever take away. Disclaimer. Some details in this story have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. The characters and events are fictionalized, but the themes of integrity, accountability, professional ethics, community trust, and second chances reflect real challenges faced in workplaces and businesses every day. The story is intended to encourage reflection, not to represent any specific individual, company, or real-world event.